She decided to clear the bushes behind the house while her husband was away. But under the roots of the vines, she noticed a piece of concrete and an old metal door. With each blow to the ground, the air grew colder, and then a sound, like breathing, came from inside. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The first breath of air inside their new home was thick with dust and age. But to Emma, it smelled like freedom. She and Dylan stood in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by sunlight that cut through the grimy windows and turned the floating dust into gold. The house wasn't much by anyone else's standards. Peeling wallpaper, uneven floors, and a roof that needed work. But to them, it was the beginning of something real. After years of cramped apartments, landlords, and saving every spare dollar, they finally had a place that belonged to them. Dylan dropped a box on the floor and turned to her with that tired, triumphant grin that she loved. "It's ours," he said, and the words hung in the still air like a promise. The property stretched wider than they expected. The front yard sloped gently down toward a cracked driveway, and behind the house, the land rose again into a wild patch of overgrown greenery. A sea of vines, tall grass, and scattered saplings choked what must once have been a garden. Somewhere beneath the weeds, Emma thought she could see the faint shape of old pathways, and maybe the corner of a stone fountain, but it was impossible to tell. She felt drawn to it immediately, the wildness, the way the sunlight caught on the leaves, the quiet pulse of nature reclaiming what people had forgotten. Dylan, on the other hand, seemed content to focus on the inside. He was already talking about fixing the floors, repainting the walls, maybe even opening up the kitchen one day. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman with a too-wide smile, had been vague when Emma asked about the property's history. "Old place," she'd said, waving one manicured hand toward the overgrown backyard. "Had a few owners, mostly absentee. I think there's some kind of old storage structure out back, but it's been sealed for years. You could clear it if you wanted to use the space." She had said it lightly, as if it were an afterthought, but the words had lingered in Emma's mind. A sealed structure? She pictured a shed or a root cellar, nothing more. Their first few days passed in a pleasant exhaustion. They ate takeout from boxes on the floor, talked about furniture they couldn't yet afford, and made plans they knew would take years to realize. The house creaked at night, the pipes groaned, and sometimes the wind slipped through the old window frames, whispering softly across their faces as they slept. Yet even in those moments, Emma felt a strange comfort. It was as though the house was alive, not in a sinister way, but in the way old things breathe with memory. On the third morning, while Dylan went into town for supplies, Emma wandered into the backyard with a cup of coffee and her phone. The air was warm and damp, heavy with the scent of soil and wildflowers. Birds darted in and out of the tangled mass of vines at the back of the property. As she stepped closer, the air seemed to cool, and she noticed how the greenery thickened unnaturally in one spot, forming a rounded mound that looked less like natural growth and more like something buried beneath. She crouched and brushed aside a few leaves. Beneath them lay a tangle of roots, gripping what appeared to be concrete. She frowned. The shape was too regular to be a rock. Maybe it was the top of an old foundation or the roof of some underground structure the agent had mentioned. She snapped a few photos to show Dylan later and stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. When she stepped back, the mound almost seemed to breathe. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw the vines shift, not from wind, but as if stirred by something beneath them. The illusion vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the soft buzz of insects and the hum of distant traffic. That night, Emma mentioned her discovery over dinner. Dylan chuckled, dismissing it easily. "Probably just an old septic tank or something," he said between bites. "Don't go poking around it alone, though. Those things can cave in." He was practical like that, always grounding her curiosity with caution. She nodded, but said nothing more. Later, while he fell asleep in front of the television, she looked at the pictures on her phone again. The vines were thicker than she remembered. Something about the symmetry of the mound unsettled her. It looked less like a hill and more like a shape that didn't belong in the middle of a garden. Over the next week, she couldn't shake her curiosity. She found herself drawn to that part of the yard every morning, staring at the way the plants seemed to thrive there. The soil was dark and damp, rich like compost, but there was something else. A faint vibration she could feel when she placed her palm on the ground. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the echo of traffic or machinery from town. But the house sat on the edge of the suburbs, surrounded by open fields. There shouldn't have been anything humming beneath the earth. The nights grew quieter. Dylan worked long hours, and Emma spent her evenings reading in bed, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house settling. Sometimes, though, a different sound joined the chorus, a low, almost inaudible thump, like a heartbeat deep in the soil. It came at irregular intervals, faint enough that she could doubt it, but real enough that it kept her awake. One night, she got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and looked out the window toward the garden. The moon hung low, painting the yard in pale silver. The mound at the back looked larger than before, its surface trembling slightly in the breeze. She told herself it was the wind, but the air outside was still. The next morning, she decided to do something about it. She fetched the gardening tools Dylan had bought and walked out into the sun. The vines resisted every pull, their roots deep and stubborn. As she worked, sweat beaded along her temples, and the smell of damp soil filled the air. Beneath the first few layers of greenery, she found thick tendrils of ivy and what looked like remnants of rotted wood. She pulled them away, and there it was again, the cold concrete surface she'd glimpsed before. She cleared more, revealing the curve of a wall, smooth and gray under the grime, with the faint outline of an arched window sealed with a rusted grate. She stepped back, heart hammering. It wasn't a shed or a tank. It was a structure. A small building, or maybe the top of one, buried beneath years of growth. The wall sloped downward into the earth, and at the base, hidden beneath soil and leaves, she thought she saw a seam, straight, deliberate, like the edge of a door. A gust of wind passed over her, carrying a strange chill despite the heat of the day. When Dylan returned that evening, she tried to tell him what she had found. He listened distractedly as he unloaded groceries. I'm sure it's nothing," he said. "Some of these houses had old bomb shelters, or storm cellars, probably sealed off for safety." He meant to be reassuring, but his casual tone irritated her. "Then why didn't anyone mention it?" she asked. "And why's it buried like that?" He shrugged. "Because nobody cared enough to dig it up. Look, we've got enough to fix upstairs. Let's not go hunting mysteries under the lawn." She let the subject drop, but later that night, as she brushed her teeth, she heard it again, the faint metallic thud, like something striking from below. The sound was subtle, barely audible, but it echoed through her bones. She turned off the light and stood still, listening. Nothing. When she climbed into bed, Dylan was already asleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same vibration through the mattress, the slow, irregular pulse of something deep in the ground. The days blurred together after that. Emma cleaned, unpacked, arranged furniture, and tried to ignore the gnawing pull that drew her back to the garden. Yet each morning, she found herself standing near the mound again, staring at the place where the vines met concrete. She began to imagine the lives of those who had lived there before, the families, who must have planted the roses that now lay strangled by ivy, the children who might have played where weeds now grew. But the more she looked, the more it felt like something else had taken ownership of the garden. The plants didn't grow. They encroached, swallowing anything that stood in their path, climbing higher with each day, as if feeding off something in the soil. One afternoon, while she knelt among the vines, she pressed her ear to the cold concrete out of idle curiosity. What she heard made her heart stop. There was sound not constant, but rhythmic, a soft, hollow rush of air like the exhale of lungs. She jerked back, falling onto the grass. The world tilted around her for a moment. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a second, she almost convinced herself that she had imagined it. But deep inside, she knew she hadn't. That night, she didn't tell Dylan. She knew how it would sound. Instead, she pretended to sleep and listened. The vibrations came again, stronger now, traveling up through the floorboards of the house. At one point, a picture frame rattled faintly against the wall. Dylan stirred beside her, but didn't wake. Emma turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the garden was a dark sea of movement, the vines shivering as if alive. By morning, she felt hollowed out by exhaustion. The sunlight did little to dispel her unease. She went outside to confirm what she already knew. The vines had spread again, covering the ground she'd cleared the day before. The concrete she had exposed was hidden once more beneath a living shroud. She stood there, the garden she'd dreamed of tending, now transformed into something alien and forbidding. Still, beneath her fear, curiosity burned. Something was beneath that mound, something that had waited through the years for someone to uncover it. She could feel it, like a faint whisper pressing against her thoughts. The garden, the house, even the air seemed to be holding its breath. That evening, as the sun slipped below the trees and the house filled with the soft orange of dusk, Emma stood at the window again. The vines shimmered faintly in the fading light, swaying though the air was still. She could almost believe they were watching her. Dylan called her name from the kitchen, asking if she wanted tea, but she didn't answer. She couldn't look away. Somewhere deep under the earth, something moved, or maybe she only thought it did. The sound was faint, like the shifting of stone. Then silence. The stillness pressed against the windows, heavy and absolute. Emma turned away at last, her skin prickling, her heart heavy with the certainty that whatever slept beneath their new home wasn't done waiting. And as night descended fully, and the house settled into quiet once more, she found herself whispering into the dark without knowing why. "What are you?" The garden, veiled in moonlight, gave no answer. But in the stillness between heartbeats, she could swear it breathed. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, scattering across the unmade bed and onto Emma's restless face. She had barely slept. The faint pulse she had heard the night before echoed still in her mind, a rhythmic reminder that something beneath the earth was alive, or at least awake. Dylan had left early for work, the sound of his truck fading into the quiet morning, and for a long while, Emma sat at the kitchen table staring out the window toward the overgrown garden. The mound waited there, veiled in green, serene and still, as if mocking her. She tried to distract herself with coffee, with dishes, with noise, but the silence between those moments always led her back to it. It was no longer simple curiosity that drove her. It was compulsion. The air outside was cool and damp when she finally stepped into the yard. Dew clung to the grass and glistened on the vines that covered the mysterious rise. With gloves on and determination that surprised even her, she approached the tangled mass once more. Each step she took brought with it a strange blend of dread and excitement. The vines seemed thicker than before, tougher, as though they had grown stronger overnight to keep her out. She grabbed a pair of garden shears and began cutting through them. The crisp sound of snapping stems filled the air, sharp and deliberate. Leaves brushed against her arms as she worked, their edges whispering against her skin, like words too quiet to catch. The labor was slow and grueling. Each time she cleared one section, another seemed to slide forward, as if the plants themselves resisted her intrusion. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, mixing with the scent of soil and decay. Underneath it all, she caught faint traces of something metallic. The concrete she had uncovered days before gleamed faintly through the gaps in the vines, slick with moisture. The more she cut away, the more deliberate the shape beneath became. This wasn't a random pile of stone. It was a structure. The wall sloped slightly, forming a low triangular shape that reminded her of the entrance to a cellar or bunker. Near its center was a small circular vent covered by a rusted grate. She crouched, pressing her face closer. A faint current of cold air brushed against her cheek. The air smelled old, untouched for years. It made her skin prickle. Something deep in that dark space exhaled softly, and for the first time, Emma felt the full weight of her isolation. She stood quickly and looked back toward the house. It seemed distant now, unreal in the bright light. The wind stirred faintly, and she thought she heard a sound from below, a low groan, metal shifting against stone. She stepped back, her pulse racing, then laughed shakily at herself. "Old pipes," she muttered, though her voice trembled. But the explanation didn't fit. This wasn't the hum of plumbing or the echo of shifting soil. It was deliberate, like something responding. By the time Dylan returned home that evening, she had cleared nearly half the mound. He looked at her mud-smeared hands and torn gloves, bewildered. "Emma, what the hell? You've been at this all day?" She gestured toward the exposed concrete wall, her eyes bright with both exhaustion and triumph. "Look at it, Dylan. This isn't just dirt. It's built. There's air coming out of it like a vent. I think it's an entrance to something." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Probably an old storm shelter. Most of these places have them. You really shouldn't be messing with it. It could collapse." She stared at him, waiting for some spark of the wonder she felt, but he only looked tired. "Promise me you won't go digging any deeper until I take a look," he said. "I'll check it out this weekend." That night, the pulse returned. She woke to the sound of metal, faint but distinct, echoing up from the garden. It was like a heartbeat again. 2 beats, pause, then one longer vibration. She sat upright in bed, holding her breath. Dylan snored softly beside her, undisturbed. The house was still, yet the sound came again, stronger this time, like a deep rumble moving through the ground. Emma climbed out of bed, bare feet touching the cold floor. She pulled back the curtain and looked outside. The garden was draped in silver light, the vines shifting slightly, as though moved by an unseen hand. For one dizzying moment, she thought she saw the faint outline of something glowing beneath the surface. A flicker of light deep within the mound. She blinked, and it was gone. When morning came, she could no longer resist. She packed a small flashlight, her phone, and an old crowbar Dylan had left in the garage. She told herself she was just going to clear a bit more, enough to see what it really was. Nothing reckless. The vines parted reluctantly under her shears, revealing more of the concrete wall. Near the base, half buried under soil, her crowbar struck something metallic. She knelt and scraped away the dirt. The curved edge of a steel door emerged, stained orange with rust. The sight stole her breath. The door was large, perhaps 5 feet tall, its hinges thick, its edges sealed with earth and time. A small circular lock sat in the center, corroded but still intact. She stared at it, trembling. There was no question now. This was an entrance. But to what? She tried to rationalize. A Cold War shelter, perhaps. Maybe a storage bunker from the 50s. Yet something about its design felt different, industrial, secretive. She pressed her ear against the cold metal. Silence. Then, faintly, a whisper of air. The same soft exhale she had felt through the vent. It seemed to pulse gently, as though the ground itself breathed. By afternoon, she was too far gone to stop. She dug around the door's frame, loosening the packed soil. Her fingers bled where the gloves had torn, but she hardly noticed. The crowbar slipped into a crack between the door and its frame. She pried, straining until her muscles ached. The door refused to budge. It was as if the earth itself clung to it, unwilling to let it open. She collapsed back on her heels, panting, sweat streaking her face. Frustration mingled with fear, but stronger than both was the pull to keep going. She could almost feel it. Whatever lay beneath wanted to be found. When Dylan came home that evening, he found her sitting in the grass, staring at the door. "Emma," he said, his tone sharp. "You didn't." She looked up at him, dirt streaked across her cheek. "It's real, Dylan. You have to see it. There's a door, and it's sealed shut. Someone built this for a reason." He crouched beside her, examining the metal. His expression shifted from irritation to curiosity. "Damn," he muttered, running his hand along the corroded surface. "That's old, and not just farm old. This looks military." He stood, frowning. "I don't like this. We don't know what's in there. Could be dangerous, could be toxic. Leave it alone until we know what we're dealing with." She nodded, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. That night, she dreamt of the door again. In her dream, it was open, the vines hanging down like curtains as she stepped through. Inside, there was light faint, bluish, flickering. The air was cold and smelled of earth and metal. She saw the outline of a table, a chair, and something else. A figure seated in the corner, unmoving, eyes hidden by shadow. When she woke, the sound of her own heartbeat filled the room. The window was slightly open, and through it came a draft, carrying the smell of damp soil. By dawn, she had made up her mind. Dylan left early again, and she waited until the sound of his truck faded completely before returning to the mound. The morning was gray, the sky heavy with clouds. She carried the crowbar and the flashlight, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Kneeling before the door, she pressed the crowbar into the seam once more and pulled with all her strength. The metal groaned, a sound like a deep sigh, and then something gave. The door shifted slightly, releasing a breath of air so cold it made her gasp. The scent that followed was of rust and age, tinged with something organic, like decaying leaves. She froze, waiting. The silence that followed was complete, suffocating. When she finally dared to look inside, the flashlight beam cut through a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. The concrete walls were slick with moisture, the floor covered in a thin layer of dirt. She hesitated only a moment before stepping down. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the smell of earth long undisturbed. Her breath fogged in the beam of her flashlight. The light caught glints of metal along the walls, bolts, brackets, and what might once have been wiring. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a small room. The beam of her light swept across it, revealing a table, a single metal chair, and shelves lined with objects half swallowed by dust. A broken lamp lay on the floor, its cord severed. Papers covered the table, their edges curled and yellowed. She stepped closer, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The words on the pages were faint but legible. Reports, schematics, lists of materials. She traced one line with her finger. Ventilation loop stable monitoring continues. Another note read, Observation protocol terminate if breach occurs. Her mouth went dry. She turned toward the wall, where photographs hung in tarnished frames. One showed a man in uniform, standing proudly in front of what looked like the same structure she was standing in now. Beside him was a woman holding a small child. Behind them, the garden bloomed, lush and orderly, the house new and shining. On the back of the photograph, written in neat handwriting, was a date, 1961. The sound came again, soft, rhythmic, not behind her, but through the walls. She swung the flashlight toward the sound, her pulse quickening. The concrete seemed to vibrate faintly, as though something on the other side was moving. She took a step back, her breathing shallow. The air pressed in, dense and heavy. For a long moment, she stood there, frozen, until the flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed her completely. Panic flared. She fumbled for her phone, its weak screen light spilling a dull glow. The air seemed to move around her now, a faint stirring as if the room itself inhaled. She turned toward the stairs, but the blackness at their base felt thicker, almost tangible. For a moment she thought she saw something in the dark, a shape, tall and still, by the far wall. She blinked, and it was gone. Her fingers brushed the cold surface of the table, then found the edge of the stairs. She climbed, her breath loud in the silence, every step an effort against the weight of the air. When she burst out into daylight, she collapsed on the grass, gasping. The door hung open behind her, exhaling its cold breath into the warm air. She scrambled to her feet and pushed it shut. The hinges screamed, but it closed with a final metallic thud. She leaned against it, trembling. The garden was silent again. That evening, she didn't speak of what had happened. Dylan noticed her pale face and trembling hands, but when he asked, she only said she had gotten dizzy while cleaning. He didn't press. They ate dinner in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. But later, when the house had gone still, the sound came again, from below. Softer this time, but unmistakable. It was a steady rhythm, patient and deep, like the slow breathing of the earth. Dylan woke once in the night and thought he heard something moving outside. He rose, went to the back door, and looked out into the darkness. The garden was a sea of shadows. The door Emma had sealed looked as though it hadn't been touched, yet for an instant he could have sworn it was slightly ajar, a thin line of blackness cutting through the green. He told himself it was the moonlight, nothing more. But as he turned back toward the house, the faintest echo of a metallic knock followed him inside, soft and deliberate, like a heartbeat beneath his feet. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of light that made even the air feel reluctant to move. Emma awoke to the soft creak of the house settling, a sound that had once comforted her, but now made her stomach twist. The night had offered her no peace. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that cold, narrow staircase descending into darkness, the breath of air rising from below, as if the earth itself were alive. Dylan was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table when she came downstairs. His coffee sat untouched, and the newspaper before him lay open to an article about a series of old military installations found along the East Coast. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I went out last night," he said quietly, "to check the garden." She froze mid-step, her throat dry. "And?" He hesitated before answering. "The door was closed, like you said, but the ground around it looked disturbed, like someone had been there, recently." Emma sank into the chair across from him, her pulse quickening. You think someone else found it? She asked. Or maybe it's still being used. The words hung between them, absurd, and yet not entirely impossible. Dylan rubbed his temples. I don't know. But we need to be careful. This isn't just some old shelter. I think it's connected to something bigger. He paused, glancing out the window toward the garden, where the vines swayed lazily in the breeze. Maybe we should call someone. The authorities. Emma shook her head quickly. And tell them what? That we found a door in our backyard leading to God knows what? They'll think we're crazy. Her voice cracked on the last word. For a while, neither of them spoke. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, each sound marking the weight of what they had uncovered. Finally, Dylan stood and grabbed his jacket. I'm going down there again, he said. If it's dangerous, I need to know before we decide what to do. She wanted to protest, to beg him not to, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she followed him outside, the morning air biting at her skin. The garden looked almost peaceful in the weak light. Birds chirped from the trees, and dew sparkled across the grass as though nothing at all was wrong. But as they approached the mound, that illusion faded. The vines that Emma had cut away had grown back thicker overnight, their roots clutching at the door as if trying to seal it again. Dylan crouched, brushing aside the greenery, and revealed the cold gleam of rusted metal beneath. He ran his fingers over the hinges, and then over the seam where the door met the concrete. Someone's been here, he murmured. See this? The faint outline of a boot print pressed into the damp soil just beside the door. Emma felt her chest tighten. It was too large to be hers, and too fresh to belong to anyone from decades past. Dylan glanced up at her. Stay close, he said, his voice steady but his eyes uneasy. He pulled the handle, and the door creaked open with a sound that sliced through the morning air like a warning. The breath of cold earth rose up to meet them. The air inside the passage felt different now. When they descended, their flashlight beams cut through a haze that shimmered faintly, like dust disturbed after years of sleep. The scent of rust and damp concrete filled Emma's lungs. The tunnel seemed longer than before, as if the earth had stretched it overnight. Their footsteps echoed softly, the sound swallowed quickly by the silence ahead. When they reached the first chamber, Emma's breath caught. The room looked changed. The table where she had found the papers was shifted slightly, and the photographs she remembered hanging on the wall were gone. Someone's been here, she whispered. Dylan nodded grimly. Or something's been moved. He knelt near the table, sweeping the beam of light across the floor. Dust patterns had been disturbed, dragged footprints leading toward the far wall where another door waited, smaller and more rusted than the first. The lock was broken, the hinges half torn from the concrete. They went through here, Dylan said. He hesitated, glancing back at Emma. Do we keep going? She didn't answer immediately. Her instincts screamed to leave, to run back to the light. But a deeper, colder pull urged her onward. We can't stop now, she said finally. We need to know what's down here. They pushed the smaller door open. Beyond it lay another corridor, narrower and darker, its walls lined with old metal cabinets. The smell here was sharper, edged with the scent of oil and decay. Dylan swept his flashlight over the cabinets. Military, he muttered. These are storage units. He tried one of the handles, but it wouldn't budge. Emma stepped closer, her light catching on faded stenciled letters across the metal. Most were illegible, but a few remained clear enough to read. Control unit, reactor, energy test. The words chilled her. Dylan, she said quietly, this isn't just a shelter. At the end of the corridor, they found a small office-like room. A desk sat beneath a rusted lamp, and a stack of old papers was strewn across its surface. Emma picked one up carefully. The ink had faded, but some of the words were still legible. Phase 2. Activation delayed pending stabilization of lower system. Energy levels unstable. She read the sentence aloud, her voice echoing faintly. Dylan frowned. What energy levels? What were they building here? His light fell on a large schematic pinned to the wall. Lines of wiring and numbers crisscrossed it, leading to a circle labeled Main Reactor Chamber. Beneath it, in small typed letters, were the words, "Do not engage without authorized personnel. Breach will result in self-seal protocol." Dylan stepped back, his jaw tightening. "We should go," he said firmly. "This looks like something experimental, something that was never supposed to be opened." But before they could move, the faint hum started again, deep beneath their feet. It rose slowly, a vibration that seemed to fill the air, pulsing like a heartbeat. Emma felt it through her shoes, through her skin, until her teeth vibrated in her skull. "What is that?" she whispered. Dylan shook his head, his flashlight beam jerking slightly as the vibration grew stronger. "I don't know," he said, "but it's coming from below us." They turned toward the direction of the hum, following it down another narrow passage that sloped gently downward. The air grew warmer, thicker. Condensation formed on the walls, dripping slowly into puddles along the floor. Emma's pulse matched the rhythm of the sound, steady, patient, alive. When they reached the end of the corridor, they found another door, larger than the rest, sealed tight with rusted bolts. A faded warning sign was stenciled across its surface. "Authorized personnel only power source below." Dylan exhaled slowly. "A power source," he murmured. "You think it's still active?" Emma looked at him, her face pale in the dim light. After all these years? It shouldn't be. He gripped the edge of the door and pulled. The bolts protested but began to give. With each twist, the hum grew louder, rising to a low roar that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When the final bolt came free, the door shifted slightly. A rush of hot, stale air escaped, carrying the sharp tang of ozone. Dylan hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open, wide enough to shine the light inside. Emma gasped. The room beyond was enormous, carved directly into the rock beneath the house. At its center stood a massive cylindrical machine, half buried in the floor, its surface covered in grime, but still faintly illuminated by a series of blinking blue lights. The machine pulsed rhythmically, the source of the vibration that had haunted their nights. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound filled the silence between them. Emma took a step forward, her eyes wide. "It's still running," she said softly. Dylan's hand caught her arm. "Don't get too close." He circled the perimeter, examining the machine. Panels of metal jutted from its surface, covered in dials and levers corroded with time. Yet despite the decay, there was an undeniable hum of life beneath it all. "This shouldn't be possible," Dylan said. "Whatever this thing is, it's been on for decades without maintenance." He wiped dust from a small plaque near the base. The letters were faded, but legible enough to make out the words. "Project Halo. Site 14. Do not disable power source." Emma's heart raced. "Project Halo," she repeated. "That sounds like a code name." She turned in a slow circle, shining her flashlight along the walls. Behind the machine, a set of thick cables disappeared into the concrete, vanishing into darkness. She followed them to a small control panel mounted nearby. A row of switches and meters lined its face. Several of the dials flickered faintly, still active. She leaned closer, brushing dust from the surface. "It's drawing power," she whispered. "But from where?" Dylan didn't answer. He was staring at something across the room. "Emma," he said quietly. "Look." On the far wall hung a metal plaque, engraved with a list of names, 12 in total. Beside each name was a date. The last one read 1963. Below the list, in smaller print, were 3 words: "System active, containment maintained." A chill ran through her. "Containment," she said. "Dylan, what do you think they were containing?" He didn't reply. The hum deepened suddenly, vibrating through the floor. The blue lights on the machine brightened, one by one, until the entire room was awash in cold illumination. Emma staggered back, shielding her eyes. Somewhere deep within the machine, a mechanical click echoed like a lock releasing. "Let's get out," Dylan shouted over the noise. They turned toward the corridor, but before they could reach it, the door they had entered through began to close on its own, grinding slowly along its tracks. Emma screamed and lunged forward, shoving against the metal, but it was no use. The door sealed with a final metallic clang, trapping them inside. The machine's hum steadied into a low, rhythmic pulse that felt almost human. For a moment, all they could do was stare, breathing hard. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise subsided. The lights dimmed again, flickering back to their original faint glow. The air felt still, charged with something unseen. Dylan pressed his ear against the door, listening. "It's locked from the other side," he said, voice tight. "We're not getting out that way." Emma turned back toward the machine. A small screen on its surface flickered to life, displaying words in faded green letters. "Primary containment restored. System stable. External access denied." "What does it mean?" she asked. Dylan shook his head, his face pale. "It means this thing thinks it's protecting something. Or someone." They stood there in the dim blue light, the hum vibrating softly beneath their feet. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Finally, the door behind them creaked. Slowly, impossibly, it began to open. Outside, the air was cooler. The vines that had once choked the mound now lay flat against the earth, their leaves glistening as if wet. The sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, touching the edges of the house with gold. Emma and Dylan stumbled out, gasping, blinking against the light. Behind them, the door closed quietly, almost tenderly, sealing itself once more. They stood there for a long time, breathing the open air, their hands shaking. The hum had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the ground beneath their feet felt still. Dylan turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." But Emma couldn't bring herself to believe it. As she looked toward the mound, she thought she saw a faint shimmer ripple across its surface, like the slow rise and fall of breath. She reached for Dylan's hand. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the stars hung low over the trees, Emma woke suddenly. The air in the room felt warm, pulsing softly against her skin. She rose and went to the window. The garden below was still, the mound just a dark shape against the grass. But as she watched, the vines shifted, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A thin line of blue light traced the seam of the hidden door. She pressed her palm against the glass, her breath catching. Behind her, Dylan stirred in his sleep. The hum began again, faint, steady, patient. And from somewhere deep beneath the house, the earth exhaled softly, as though waking from a long dream. Emma stood there in silence, her reflection merging with the darkness beyond, and understood that the thing they had uncovered had not died. It had only been waiting. The house, the garden, the machine. All of it was alive, bound together by something older and deeper than either of them could comprehend. Outside, the vines shivered, curling closer to the mound. The air thickened, humming faintly like the beat of a buried heart. Emma closed her eyes and whispered, "It's breathing again." And in the darkness beneath their feet, the secret they had disturbed began its quiet, patient rhythm once more. The house, at last, remembering how to breathe. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel. There's more coming soon. Watch the next videos and share this one with someone who loves mysterious stories.